So William Bartley's whole project here, as we've been going throughout the book, the Retreat to Commitment, is, as he says at the beginning of this appendix, this is Appendix 4, that it is an examination of the entire Western tradition of rationalism and what he believes he found at the heart of rationalism, which were a series of mistaken assumptions and, in large part, justificationism. He moved through them throughout the book and removed them wherever he could, and at the end of it, he comes up with pancritical rationalism, which is an improvement upon Karl Popper's critical rationalism. Most importantly, he was pushing back on the assumption that there was a logical limit, an inherent logical limit to what rationalism could be. That for any rationalist out there, you must begin by taking certain things irrationally. Certain ideas, certain things have to be separated from the rational enterprise and held on to as a matter of faith if you're going to have the rational enterprise at all. But of course, Bartley walks through a lot of this in his theory, and most of all, he's walking through that issue of justificationism. He goes on to show that nothing of any interest, nothing of any philosophical interest, can in fact require justification. Whenever it is sought out, it never does the job you think it's going to do, and it's never actually necessary. What is possible and what is necessary is criticism. But this too needs to be unfused from justificationism. You can't criticize a theory in light of some other principle and then say the theory has survived or failed the criticism by lights of that other theory without engaging in a degree of justificationism. And it's just this type of justificationism, this quiet, smuggled justificationism, that Bartley saw as the biggest problem that he was addressing. At no point in his philosophy do you ever have to make a retreat to commitment. You never have to justify anything. You never have to put forward a dogma. You never have to hold any particular position exempt from criticism and review. And the old theories of rationalism, such as anything that is rationalist must be deduced or induced or in some other way warranted, was simply another dogma sitting in the heart of the rationalist enterprise. So Bartley comes across and presents pancritical rationalism. And here we have two particular positions, one of John Post and one of John Watkins, each pushing back upon Bartley, each saying that yes, the formulation is very interesting, but there is a logical paradox at the heart of the enterprise. So first, John Post. Now, Post focuses on the claim of Bartley's, where he says everything is open to criticism. And this is something I just touched on previously as well, perhaps in a slightly earlier episode if I break these up. But that's the core of pancritical rationalism. Everything is open to criticism. Everything, including criticism. But we'll get to that. Now, Bartley's going to go on to say that he doesn't think Post is right even in his logical criticism. But he says even if he were right, that the remainder or the most of Bartley's argument actually still stands. And he goes back into this Bartley and just tries to address just what he meant when he said everything is open to criticism. He's pushing back on those old classical formulations of rationalism, the ones that insist upon justifying ideas and justifying principles and justifying theories. And when these particular types of rational theory put forward the notion of criticism and how important criticism is, they're always doing so, again, as a form of justification. As you might like to formulate, and Bartley does here, a justificationist theory of criticism. So, in this formulation, to justify an idea is to derive it from an authority, perhaps. That authority lays out what a good trait might be or a bad trait, or a good theory and a bad theory, or any other formulation of this kind. The point is that knowledge is bound up within that authority. And we can discover what is good or bad, perhaps in the world, if that's how you want to formulate it, by simply reducing back to that authority, or to statements of that authority and what the good traits should be. Everything is already determined. Anything that can be reduced is justified, reduced back to the authority, and anything which cannot be reduced back to that authority is rejected, which is criticism. It's just justification is criticism. Now we move forward from the Greeks to people like David Hume, and it was Hume who wished to use sensory observation as his authority and his way of evaluating right from wrong, good from bad, or justifying as true or criticizing as false. And it has the same problems as the old Greek traditions of criticism and rationalism. It is helpful in some ways. I mean, as Bartley gives credit here. For example, you can't reduce God, or you can't produce God, and the immortal soul, for example, from sensory observations alone. And so this gives Hume the ability to reject them. But he's still rejecting them as a form of justificationism. Because he can't reduce them to sensory observations, they're being rejected. So perhaps it's a better authority than some of the old Greek authorities would have been. But it is still an authority and it's still justificationism. Because, as Bartley goes on to say here, Hume soon discovered that, for example, the idea of causality or other scientific laws, the idea that minds exist beyond my particular mind or minds exist beyond Hume's mind, the idea of an external world, or even any statement about history, none of this can be reduced or produced from sensory observations alone. Now, the great problem, and I think this is one of the most important things that Bartley did say in one of the early appendices, was that the problem of this is often simply the problem of logical strength. I won't go over that again here, but it is an easy way to understand why people went so wrong. So Bartley, perhaps more importantly, is looking at a particular issue at the heart of the rationalist enterprise. And that is, it's not an easy way to explain this, but he puts forward it as the question of how do you know? And of course, when you have that question, you have to keep asking that question. So, for example, I think I had a podcast. I think I did discuss this with Paul Levinson in our podcast. And for example, you may say the idea of rationalism is you're walking across the street and you see a car coming and it's going to hit you. So you step out of the way because you rationally don't want to die. And so the rational decision is you avoid the car. And then you say, well, why don't you want to die? And the answer would be, perhaps I have a family and they need my support. You say, well, why do they need your support? You say, well, they'll need my emotional support, they need my financial support, and say, why do they need your financial? So at some point, you can see the question just runs and runs and runs, and it can be this sort of why question, this childish kind of why question. Or it can be that question of how do you know? How do you know? How do you know? It keeps going back. And what you end up with is an infinite regress. And this was a problem at the heart of rationalism for a long time. If this is an infinite regress, well, what the rationalists used to say is at some point we need to make an irrational stop. We say no more, this is it. We're not going to keep asking these questions and answering these questions. It's not going to happen. We're going to plant our feet and say this is it. And from this point, which is an irrational commitment, we can't justify it, of course, we can't answer all those questions of how do you know or why. We're not going to answer those questions. But from that position, we can then move forward. What we've done is put an end to infinite regress, which was a problem at the heart of rationalism for a long time. Of course, this opened the door to the fightists and the irrationalists out there, who could now turn around to all the rationalists and say, see, you make irrational commitments too. You're just like us. And it was a mistake, as Bartley says. It wasn't necessary. You didn't have to draw this line. Those questions of why, or how do you know, well, they were begging justificationist answers. There's nothing you can give that would be appropriate. There's nothing you could give that would be definitive. They're asking you for a justification. And justifiers, in a sense, or justifications, are beyond criticism. But of course, nothing you say is beyond criticism, as Bartley says. These dogmas were not necessary. It was simply a misunderstanding of the logical structure of what argument was. And I think what Bartley is most proud of in his philosophy, he mentions it again and again, and I think this is the area where he clearly had the most impact back upon Popper, is where he successfully separates the idea of authority and justificationism from the idea of criticism. Shows a lot of philosophers and a lot of rationalists out there the mistakes that they were making, and showed them the things that they couldn't see or believe perhaps weren't there. And perhaps most importantly, the door they were opening to the irrationalists, their enemies. Bartley simply goes on to say that all positions are open to criticism. All of them, including criticism, including rationalism. There's nothing you can say, there's no position you can stake, no theory you can devise that exists beyond criticism. And logically, there needn't be. This is the important point. There needn't be. Because this didn't surreptitiously just sneak into Karl Popper's philosophy. He believed it was necessary, till Bartley showed him otherwise. There is no point in any argument where we ever need to stop and say this has to exist beyond argument. And he says that John Post and John Watson, as far as he can see, wouldn't doubt this. He thinks that they would agree with him upon this. He thinks that that spirit of pancritical rationalism is something that they buy into, or would buy into. Of course, he's not having a direct dialogue here. He's responding in print. What they've missed, says Bartley, is all that context. They remove criticism from that context that Bartley has just given. And they use it in, perhaps I should quote him here, a very wide, uncontrolled sense, and have from thereafter gone on to discuss Bartley's theory, or criticism, and whether it is open to criticism, in terms that are irrelevant to what Bartley is actually arguing for. So let's get into it. This is the argument from John Post, what Bartley calls the post-in paradox. And looking at it now, I think I got it absolutely nailed on earlier on when I foreshadowed this particular paradox. And that is that pancritical rationalism can be broken up into two parts. That is, position A, and this is what Bartley does say about himself, that is A, all positions open to criticism. And then there's B, which is A is open to criticism, which is another way of saying all things are open to criticism, as well as this statement that all things are open to criticism, because that statement is another thing in the world. So it must be open to criticism. And I will do my best not to repeat too much here, because I know it doesn't translate very well into a podcast, but we can look at the paradox like this. If B turns out to be false, that is, A is not open to criticism, the claim all things are open to criticism is not open to criticism, then A is also false, because A says all things are open to criticism, but the statement, this all things is open to criticism, is not open to criticism. So B and A are both false if B is false. But if you had another argument, which simply focused on A, that all things are open to criticism, and you criticize that successfully, then A would be false, but B would be true, because A has been successfully criticized, showing not all things are open to criticism, and the whole content of B is that the statement A, all things are open to criticism, is open to criticism. I'm already gone a little too convoluted, I can tell. But this also shows that if B is false, then B is also true, because B is something in the world. And A says all things are open to criticism. So it turns out that the statement all things are open to criticism is not open to criticism. Then B is false and true at the same time. Any attempt to criticize B in any way simply demonstrates that B exists, or demonstrates what B is, that A is open to criticism. This means B is uncriticizable, and therefore means that A must be false because B is uncriticizable. Now, perhaps when I publish this series of podcasts, I will cut and paste the little section from Bartley's book, if I can find it somewhere online, and I can cut and paste that just below the podcast, where he goes through this, where John Post goes through this, just to better explain that. Because every time I think I've got it, you simply find yourself running in circles. And if I pause for a few moments, I lose it. Even though it is fairly straightforward, but it's simply convoluted the way it's written, the way it sounds, the way it hits the ear. So how about we just accept for here on in that there is a paradox there. There certainly seems to be a paradox there. And it would be much easier to read it. And I will do my absolute best to find a copy of it and just simply stick that. It's only about 5 lines long. I'll stick that little section just under the podcast in the description. Now, Post says when he discovered this that it surprised him. Bartley says it didn't surprise Bartley at all. It didn't surprise him, and in his own words, did not disturb him. In fact, he expected, and this is his own words here, this is a quote, "I have assumed ever since I wrote this book that some such result would turn up." Now, this sounds strange. A logical paradox at the heart of the enterprise, saying that all things are open to criticism, was surely something you'd expect Bartley not to want to show up, and certainly something that would seem damaging to his theory. Bartley is saying here just the opposite. It's not true. Even if the paradox exists, then he expected such a paradox to turn up. He says it was inevitable, because the statement of pancritical rationalism, that all things are open to criticism, including this statement that all things are open to criticism, as he says, is simply, obviously, self-referential. And he says a lot of this simply is because he never got around to formalizing his position and always simply expressing it in natural language. And as Tarski's shown, that all natural language contains paradoxes and is often self-referential. So what is really the impact of what John Post has shown here? And is it damaging to Bartley's theory? And the question perhaps towards Bartley that he presents himself here is, are you still committed, William Bartley, to the idea that this statement, all things are open to criticism, is in fact open to criticism? Because if he's not, then he's not a pancritical rationalist, he's simply a critical rationalist. Or at least that's what it seems. Or perhaps the question better put to Bartley is he committed to that position, to pancritical rationalism, despite the discovery of such a paradox? And Bartley says no. He says he would give it up in an instant. At least that particular formalization of pancritical rationalism. He says, I don't like it. This is a quote. I don't like it at all. I don't believe in it. He says, I don't take it as a presupposition or a dogma. I have no faith in it. The whole point of pancritical rationalism is to never find yourself committed to an uncriticizable statement. So what to make of Bartley's lack of faith in this regard? Bartley says that the point, and this is the idea, that B is uncriticizable, is only in fact uncriticizable in terms of the way that John Post has laid it out. It's uncriticizable in terms of John Post's argument only. And Bartley says that there's good reason to believe that a different formalization would have these paradoxes melting away, or the Postian paradox melting away. The paradox is a semantic one. And as Bartley points out here, Frege and even Bertrand Russell put forward a number of ways in which we can get around this, or avoid getting bogged down in such semantic paradoxes. There's distinctions we can make at the level of language and meta-language. And the mere possibility of such a solution, a semantic solution to a semantic paradox, would make B criticizable after all, because the possibility exists for it to be criticized. There is a potential means for invalidating Post's argument out there. And Post's argument says there is no way to criticize Bartley's formalization of pancritical rationalism. But if a possibility exists to criticize it, well, that must be by definition a refutation of Post's paradox. But I don't think Bartley thinks here that the semantic element here, or at least the semantic paradox, is the real issue. But if we may, for a moment, if Tarski's right that no consistent language of any kind can ever operate in a way that isn't self-referential, then it is absurd of someone like Post, and this is Bartley's word, he uses the word absurd here, to demand, and another quote here, demand unlimited self-reference in natural language. Post is demanding that the language Bartley uses, or the language of pancritical rationalism, is not self-referential. And perhaps that is the heart of the Postian paradox in some ways. Because as Bartley said just earlier, that B is simply a self-reference of A. And as David Miller said earlier, which I brought in just before, I think perhaps in the earlier podcast if I cut these up, that B is a statement and not a core position. There's a difference here. Now, Post goes on to criticize this kind of way, this kind of means of removing paradoxes, and particularly the paradox that Post has found. But on this one, I believe Bartley has the bulk of mathematicians and logicians and semantic specialists on his side. I mean, in some ways, and there's a quote in here from Bartley, this paradox sounds a little like the lies paradox, where it is possible to speak quite plainly about something and get yourself immediately wrapped up in the loops of the language itself. I'm not going to dig into the lies paradox because, again, just like it was a little turgid and circular talking about A and B and post-formalization, I will get stuck in the same thing if I start doing this with the lies paradox, because the lies paradox, again, is self-referential. But it goes like this, at least from the outset. It says, this statement is false. And that's the paradox right there. Because if that sentence is true, then it must be false. And if it's false, then it must be true. And this continues. There are other addendums you can add on it and meta-language that people often put, and it just rolls and rolls and rolls in circles, and it appears to be a paradox. But the paradox is simply because it is self-referential. So what does Post offer up as perhaps an alternative here? And something that Bartley considers to be a more serious disagreement? Well, Post thinks that we can escape these paradoxes in critical rationalism and pancritical rationalism by adopting the philosophies of either Emre Lakatos, of course, another disciple of Popper, or W.V. Quine. A core of this is something incredibly problematic. That is a rejection of the analytic-synthetic distinction. Now, again, I'm really not going to get into that, but the problem if you take such an approach is that it lets the user abandon the rules of logic, particularly a part of logic that Bartley is incredibly keen on showing to be important, which is the transmissibility of falsity. That is, in terms of logical deduction, that the conclusions transmit falsity back to the premises. If I were to say, for example, all flowers are beautiful, and therefore, as a conclusion, I might say, roses are beautiful. And then you have a rose in your hand, you say, therefore, this rose must be beautiful. If it turned out that that rose was not beautiful, it would transmit the falsity of that back to the statement, roses are beautiful, which would transmit the falsity back to the previous statement, all flowers are beautiful, and so on. And so to avoid the paradox, Post's own paradox, Post suggests that we abandon doing just that we don't transmit the falsity of B back to A, or we don't accept that it is really a logical transmission. The trouble with this, and of course trouble for Bartley, and why Bartley's unhappy with this, even though he has his own questions with the analytic synthetic distinction, is that he holds open that all positions, all statements, be open to criticism, including the fundamental laws of logic. Those too are open to criticism. So you can't step outside of the paradox by removing a piece of logic and saying that's acceptable now, because the removal of that piece of logic is criticizable still. Bartley formulates Post's addendum like this, that if we only abandon logic, completely abandon it, or at least abandon it ad hoc and in our favor, then lucky for us, the paradoxes no longer arrive. Well, of course they don't, though. What else would you expect? The whole point of a paradox, of a real paradox, is that they reach into the heart of all logical argument. And that's why they're so important. It's the logic of them. And of course, Post also brings in at this point Lea-Henry. So the removal before, what I've just spoken about, was mostly Quine. And when he brings in Lea-Henry, he talks about, and again, I can't get into Lacanian theory here all the time, but the idea that there's a core research project of a theory, or a core of a research project, some central animating aspect of what we're working on. And that thing must exist beyond criticism, must exist as irrefutable. And if you come this far in the series, you will obviously know that you don't need me to tell you that Bartley would have a problem with someone saying that a certain aspect, no matter how core and central it may be, is beyond criticism. And moreover, how do you escape criticism? How do you escape a paradox, perhaps, is a better way of expressing it. How do you escape a paradox, a logical paradox, or a semantic paradox? By simply saying that the thing, the paradox, the problem, is at the heart or the core of the research project. And therefore, we don't have to worry about criticism. That, it would seem, is another simple dogmatic step into irrationalism. It's taken out of position to be beyond criticism without having to explain why it's beyond criticism. Not that perhaps it's helpful, not that perhaps it might be useful for our day-to-day work or our practical science or the works we do on the ground, but logically beyond criticism. And Bartley goes on to say here that neither Quine, who was Bartley's teacher, nor Lea-Henry, who was Bartley's colleague, would be thrilled with what Post is doing with their theories and how he is deploying them simply to avoid a semantic paradox. So then Bartley asks the question here, perhaps we ought to think, what if Post were right? What if the paradoxes were real? What if it were impossible to avoid semantic paradoxes of the kind? Bartley's already said that there is possibility from Tarski and Russell in their theories to offer criticisms of a semantic paradox of this kind, but what if it were impossible? Now, before we get too deep here, Bartley says, just take a break. He is saying that he believes these paradoxes are, in his words, capable of being deactivated. And he's simply amusing and holding the question open here. Perhaps it's interesting to walk into what Post is offering. So, what if Post were right? Well, Bartley says he would not have to abandon the position that all positions are open to criticism, but would simply have to stress, and do so perhaps in more convincing ways than he originally did in the book, that it is not logically necessary to ever hold a dogma or ever be committed to a dogma. Now, he does want to add here, and as I'm reading it now, perhaps this is a little foreshadowing of what David Miller's criticism was of Post's criticism, which is, he says that there are some particular statements that are produced by semantic paradoxes of this kind, or what Miller perhaps called the original positions, that exist as uncriticizable. Now, I'm going to leave that to Miller and to the discovery of tautologies, for example, folding out and falling out of all theories all scientific theories of any kind. But it is interesting to read that again here and see that Bartley was slightly on to what Miller would come to later as a form of defense of Bartley. And secondly, if Post was right, Bartley says that his characterization of what rationalism was would remain almost entirely intact. That a rationalist would be someone who holds all positions, and all of his positions, including his most fundamental positions and basic philosophical standards, open to criticism, in the sense that he does not want to ever hold anything as a dogma and doesn't believe it is necessary. He doesn't need dogmas. The only uncriticizable statements that a rationalist would ever harbor would be only uncriticizable in a completely different sense of the word. That would be those particular things that are forced upon the rationalist by a semantic paradox in the course of otherwise rational argument, and as a process, an unavoidable process of using natural language. He would be neither committed to these nor led by them in any way. Moreover, Bartley believes all his other claims about pancritical rationalism would also survive, including his solution to the fides dilemma and skepticism, and importantly his distinction between justificationism and critical argument, and how you can detach the two. It would still remain impossible within any justificationist or authoritarian theory of knowledge to resolve that issue of ultimate commitment, the idea of integrity and identity. His observations of Western justificationist tradition would remain intact. His historical observations, the possibility for a open, non-justificationist form of criticism would still be there. Importantly, nothing within those semantic paradoxes invokes limits on rationality. And that's what Bartley was against, limits on rationality, or require in any way the need to make an ultimate commitment. Not even to that statement that B is uncriticizable, for example. The uncriticizability of B, if shown to be true, would also show in no way that a rationalist must be committed to it, that he must make a dogma out of it, because it too would be open to criticism. And I think Bartley is right in here when he says, I think Post just simply doesn't understand deeply enough what Bartley is doing here. By discovering a challenge, a logical paradox, this does not mean the end of a rationalist enterprise. It's simply a new beginning. And Bartley goes on to say here that even if someone were to do as he believes Post is doing here, which is to make a dogma out of B and accept it as certified truth and therefore a certified paradox, there's nowhere that leads. There's nothing to be done with it. It has no real content, or at least insufficient content, to really affect any other claim that could be made. And Bartley here talks about and reaches out to other similar semantic paradoxes that arose over the years, particularly within the justificationist approach, which I think he is indicating Post is a part of here. And he said those were never turned into dogmas either. They're simply useless when it comes to that purpose. And that's a quote of his. They're useless for that purpose.